Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well. We're just going to wait a few seconds whilst everyone connects and joins.
The people are joining.
Afternoon, all.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, I'm going to give it 10 more seconds or so, and then we're going to get started for our webinar today. Thanks, everyone, for joining this afternoon. Okay, I think let's get started. We've got a few more people joining, but let's get started with our conversation. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion from Awareness to Action. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to have a conversation about how you can turn your DEI initiatives from awareness to action. And we're going to run through some really clear key takeaways that you can take from this webinar today. By way of introduction, my name is Khadija Lewis. I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. I'm a senior consultant at the Clear company. And I'm also going to hand over to my colleagues to introduce themselves. So Maria, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Maria. I'm a managing consultant within the Clear company, and I have, I think, 8 years of diversity and inclusion consultancy experience. Initially in Brazil, so I'm born and raised Brazilian, and for the past 5 years here in the UK. So that's me.
Thanks, Maria. Alex.
Yeah, my name is Alex. I am a director at the Clear company and collaborate and support our clients on their DEI strategy and on taking actions to drive impact across the organization. I've been at the Clear company for 3 years now, working with clients across multiple sectors from construction, infrastructure industry to insurance, recruitment, or real estate. So quite a diverse mix of organization.
Nice. Thanks so much, both. Okay, so we're going to start our conversation shortly, but just as a bit of housekeeping, so all of you as attendees are joining on listen-only mode, so you should just be able to see us and the slides that we're sharing. Please feel free to submit any questions that you have in the Q&A box, so that should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit those questions to us, and we will answer those at the end. If we don't have a chance to answer the questions, we've got a lot to share with you today, and one of our team will be in touch to answer your questions and to continue the conversation. But it will be great to see kind of the questions and reflections that you have as we dive into this really important topic. So without further ado, let's get into the discussion about how we can turn our DEI efforts into awareness, from awareness to action. So our first area of focus is around taking DEI beyond events and statements. So my first question to Maria and Alex is, how do you make the link between DEI and the business strategy?
Well, great. I'm going to get started on this one, Alex. That's okay. Great. So for me, that's where D&I starts to be really interesting. So, when we move from awareness to strategy, or when we start to make those links between D&I and the business strategy, is really when we move from the approach towards D&I of like D&I is the right thing to do, to how can D&I actually propel our business? How can D&I for example, ensure we are future-proofing our talent, or helping us foresee market trends and reach diverse markets, or even enhance our retention and improve our culture. So when those links start to be made is when D&I is, instead of us seeing D&I as another thing that we have to do, and, the right thing is something that is really strategic for the business and propels the business strategy. So I think that is kind of my view on it.
And really, so fully agree with that, and really as the kind of the first step on making the link between the DEI and the business strategy is understanding where you are today, because you want to ensure that any actions that you take address some clear needs that have been identified, and that those needs identified also then support the business strategy. And you also want to have a clear starting point to then measure impact or progress against. So therefore, like this first step when you want to make the link with your business strategy is actually doing a baseline assessment of where you are, and really understanding what are those key needs, what are the key challenges, and what does it mean in terms of my people, policies. What is the feedback from employees? Either if you're already doing surveys, what are those surveys, insights telling you, or it's directly engaging with your employees to seek feedback from employees, leaders, so everyone across the organizations. So then based on those insights and having an understanding of where you are, you then have a clear baseline to then track progress on future actions that you want to link to your business strategies, business strategy, and link it to clear needs that you've identified.
Yeah, there's really good points, Alex, because when in our strategy work with our clients, one of the things we always emphasize is for you to be able to understand where you want to get to, you really need to understand where you're coming from. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to come up with actions that are actually going to address the root causes of any inclusion challenges that you might be facing. So, we see time and time again, organizations jumping into action before actually understanding where they're coming from. And of course, there's value in that. D&I awareness in itself is really important. And, I think we lack that as a society. So that in itself is important. But when we think about making that into a sustainable D&I strategy and sustainable culture change, it needs to be something more structured, even if just, for the sake of being able to explain, why are we doing this? Why are we using budget to do this actions? Why are we prioritizing this and not that right now? So, this all kind of links back to that, doesn't it?
Yeah. And you mentioned about making it sustainable, which is really key. It's not really like a one-time action. It will really be about long-term initiative and actions that support the business strategy. So you really want to link that to your employee life cycle. And with clients, we always, when they go through for example, when they go through the Clear Shared accreditation, what we always want to do is ensuring that the accreditation or actions they take, they support their people priorities and they support their business priorities. So it will really help them also get the management buy-in to drive those actions. And also it will avoid this scenario where it becomes additional work on top of what you do.
Exactly.
Where it's really aligned to what you do day to day. So for example, we have an organization that wants to focus on improving their brand profile because they want to really focus on attracting different talents. So what we will work on with them is, so actually, how do they ensure they are clear on their current customer base and how they want to have that reflected into their companies? What does it mean for the language they use on their websites or as part of their solutions? So those are kind of practical example of actions that can be aligned to a company objective.
Yeah. And I think as well, just understanding how that also relates to how the business does things at the moment as well. And like you said, that baseline, getting a really clear understanding of where we are and how do we make sure that it makes sense to our people. Like you said, what language do we use? How do we make sure that it's really clear? Like you said, why we're using the budget. And I think the really clear takeaway there that I've heard from both of you is really starting and prioritizing having a baseline kind of assessment to identify the needs that you have in this area and any specific gaps that are very unique to you and your business. And then aligning the kind of DEI actions that you want to kind of introduce with the business strategy to ensure that it kind of maintains that momentum and also kind of has that sustainable impact that Maria spoke about at the beginning. Thank you both so much. And that kind of goes on really nicely to our next question about kind of how to maintain momentum on your DEI journey. And I guess acknowledging that real change kind of takes time to maintain the momentum. So my next question to you both is, how can we sustain momentum in our DEI efforts?
Well, that's such a good question. It's the $1,000,000 question, really, isn't it? How do we maintain momentum? Because as you said, Khadija, D&I change does take time, but that doesn't mean that there aren't quick wins that we can actually do in the short term. And I kind of wanted to illustrate that with an example. So we've worked with several law firms, with several legal firms, and when we talk about diversifying that industry, it takes decades, because really when you start to get into the more kind of senior positions in there, industry, these are people who have decades of experience in extremely specific areas of law practice. So, you're not going to change that immediately. So, there are plenty of examples of legal firms that are investing in really long-term building the pipeline, like starting in grad schemes and et cetera, and really building that. So, in 10 years' time, you'll have a much more diverse kind of senior level of the organization. But, there's plenty that we can do in the short term as well. So, for example, embedding inclusive hiring practices in the short term, making sure that the process, it mitigates biases, so that one, the diverse talent that is available right now is considered and has a real chance of, being afforded the opportunity if they are the right person for the job. But also you're kind of building the culture, because if you don't do that work in 10 years time, those people will be there, but your firm is still not kind of looking at them. So, they're still not visible. So, I think it's pairing, the momentum is kind of created by pairing quick wins with long-term goals. So, we have and that's the strategy as well, links back to the strategy. So, this is the goal, but to get there, these are all the things that we need to do in the in-between. So yeah, that would be my take on that question.
Yeah, and I love what you said there, Maria, about this embedding DEI and thinking long-term. It really takes time to transform a culture.
Mm-hmm.
And support inclusion across your organization. And that's why we always say to companies, DEI is not really a one-time initiative. I've mentioned it earlier, and really instead should be seen as like this thread that runs through your employee life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
That would be really my biggest advice for companies, to think about the employee life cycle. So from how you attract talent in the organization, so how you onboard them and ensuring
Mm-hmm.
it's inclusive processes to do that, to then how you develop and retain the talent you have across the organization, to also how you promote, even how you kind of offboard employees. Right? It's really thinking through about the employee life cycle. And if then you look at DEI through this lens, it will help you build the momentum. So again, to give some more practical example in recruitment, then it's how then are your job description written in terms of the language, again, back to the language you use, some of the criteria that highlight also your inclusive policies, so type of skills you're after, and how you will enable a talent to come in and be able to perform at their best, really thinking through about your job description right from the recruitment, in the recruitment process. And then when people are in is on the performance. I've mentioned earlier about developing and promoting talent. Is all your performance criteria transparent and clear for everyone? And how do you ensure and support managers to drive consistency on how they assess performance and do that again in an inclusive way? So you don't want people that have flexible working or someone that has a disability to be penalized because of that on how their performance is being assessed. So all of those elements will then help you maintain momentum and drive this inclusive culture.
Yeah, I think, what you said, about there's so much to do around the employee life cycle, really, to embed DEI. So, I think, as you were talking, Alex, I was thinking, I think there's this one thing, which is there's a lot to be done. So there's always something that can be happening in the background or in the foreground around DEI, and that links to what I think is the most important thing in maintaining momentum, that is remembering that DEI, the more people talk about it, think about it, reflect about it, discuss it, push back, challenge, and the conversation arises around that, the better it is really for change, because DEI is extremely dynamic. The context changes all the time. There's never going to be a final destination and we're done and dusted. DEI is done. So, the kind of like keeping the conversation going and remembering you don't need to do everything at once. That if one is impossible, two, it is a cultural change that takes time. So for people to understand what's going on, why that's being done, and the implications, is much more effective in our experience if the conversation is kind of like small but consistent steps. So there's always something going on, and there's always a conversation happening, rather than a lot of things at once, and then you don't talk about it for 2 years, and then people forget about it, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and that's again, that's where you want to keep the momentum.
Yeah.
Rather than having those one-time conversation. Maybe just, another point for everyone to consider is leadership commitment, leadership buy-in as well. It's so important to be able to move forward. Otherwise, it's a bit like having you have a car, you have the passengers. If you don't have an engine to help you move forward, you're not really going to go far. And you need the kind of the leadership commitment and buy-in, which then also goes back to our point earlier. It's easier to engage with leaders when you really make the link between your DEI initiative with the business strategy and the business priorities. Right? And then on top of that, I will add is if you can then engage with leaders about their own emotional connection or an inclusion. Say every leader will have their own driver. So connecting with them, on that to bring them into the journey and have their commitment to support the journey is really key to sustain momentum.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I really agree with what you've both said there. And I think momentum will look different for different stakeholders that you engage, right? And I think it's leaning into the engagement that you get from different stakeholders. Momentum for a leader might look different from an employee resource group, for example. And that's what we see with clients. And we encourage that because it then contributes to a business's journey on their DEI maturity. And what we've heard there is kind of, I guess, the takeaway from this section is the importance of embedding DEI throughout the employee life cycle as a way to maintain momentum. Alex spoke about ensuring leadership buy-in and kind of, as we've spoken about in the first question, aligning these efforts with business strategy in order to maintain sustainable momentum. And as Maria said, kind of not doing everything at once, kind of little and often, but also not by yourself as well, which I've kind of alluded to there, which very nicely leads on to our last question, which is around DEI governance. And this is kind of focusing on kind of how do we define ownership, accountability in order to ensure success. So my last question to you both, Maria and Alex, is who owns DEI within the organization?
Yeah, who owns DEI? So we often have this conversation with client on the governance and ownership, and often it's owned within the people, HR team. However, where we see companies having the most success is when there is collective ownership of DEI, in terms of the leaders, the different function across the business. So it's not relying all on the HR or the DEI lead to drive things forward. So this is where what I would encourage everyone to do is to clearly define what are the roles and responsibilities around DEI across the organization. What is the starting point? So this could be part of the baseline assessment we've mentioned earlier, where having clear view on what is the role of the HR team to drive DEI, and that's why there may be a focus around some of the policies, processes across the employee life cycle, for example. Then there is also what is the role of leaders, back to their commitment, driving accountability, on reporting on progress as well for the organization. So that's another stakeholder group to review roles and responsibility for. Then another one, depending on the size of your organization and how your structure, you might want to have employee networks, for example. So then what are the roles of those networks? And the chair of those networks, again, are they really clear on their purpose and how they support the DEI and business strategy? Then some larger organizations, they even have like DEI champions, as well. So again, what are the roles and responsibilities of those DEI champions? And another example is it's not only about the HR team or employee network. It can be also about your procurement function or your marketing function. They also have a role to play into DEI, your marketing, especially external facing. The same with procurement, with the supply chain, and what you expect, from your supply chain, for example. So really, I would say in terms of ownership, was traditionally it's always with HR or DEI, the DEI lead, really strongly recommend to do this review to empower the business to also have a clear role to support DEI.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so important, isn't it? Because ultimately, people's time is very precious. So we don't want people to be misaligned or reinventing the wheel, or duplicating, pulling things into different directions, and that, unfortunately, that is still common because especially in the kind of early stages of D&I in organizations, we see a lot of bit of like, oh, we have people who are really keen, and then people who are really keen do things, but they're not driving a strategy. They're just doing things out of their own will, which is great. It's great to, that is a good momentum propeller. But if they're all pulling in different directions, then things are not going in a single place. And also, the majority of the organization is never going to be extremely engaged. Those are people who can be engaged and should be, but there needs to be a sort of direction and a plan in place, so people say, okay, so I'm doing this because this is where we're going with this thing. So that, I think, it links back to the first question as well of how do we link D&I with the business strategy. So we can say, we are doing these initiatives and people are getting engaged in these initiatives because this is the direction we are going towards. So I completely agree with you, Alex. I think having clearly defined roles and responsibilities is very, very important within D&I. So we don't just rely on people who are the most engaged or the most willing, but rather we bring everyone on the journey as well.
Yeah, completely agree with that, what you've both shared there. And I think, the key takeaway there is just what you've both emphasized around defining very clearly who owns DEI and clarifying the roles across the different stakeholders that you might be working with on this work. And that's really to ensure that there's alignment. And as Maria said, that, you might have the good momentum propellers. I really like that phrase, but also thinking about how can you invite people to contribute in a way that is sustainable so that we continue that momentum, as we spoke about in the last question as well. Great. Okay. So we've got a few minutes left, just under 10 minutes, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in the Q&A box. So thank you everyone for your questions. The first question that we've got is, how do we get senior leaders to take ownership of DEI? Big question.
Should I go, Alex? Do you want me to go?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. So how to get senior leaders? I think, again, that depends on where the organization is departing from. I know it's a bit of like a cheeky answer, but ultimately it is true, because there are different ways we can go about it. So if leadership isn't getting engaged because they don't really understand D&I, then they probably need to be formally trained or coached, into leadership. So understanding what's their personal why, what does it mean to them, and also what does it mean for their work in improving their teams and improving their deliverables. So, really understanding because ultimately for senior leaders is, how can this be useful for me to deliver the work that I need to deliver? So, good inclusive leadership training will definitely address that question, and kind of, that would be the top priority. So I think one of the ways is through training. If leadership isn't getting engaged because they don't understand, there's no strategy in place, then that is the answer, right? So, there needs to be, this is where we are departing from and this is where we're going, and that kind of clear, logical explanation, evidence-based as well. That is like, this is why we need to go in this direction. So hearts and minds, as people say, isn't it? So what do you think, Alex?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on, and really on finding those leaders that really are already engaged, and then really using them as champions to also influence the other leaders, to bring them along on the journey, and always assuming that leaders have always this right and positive intent. It's how do you then equip them and providing the right tools and guidance to be able to lead, inclusively.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a question that we get a lot in terms of how to engage senior leaders. But I think, kind of what you've both shared, but also really understanding what the gap is in order to understand how to address it is kind of that. And it speaks back to that baseline, isn't it, that we've been speaking about throughout our time together. Nice. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question, so let's have a go.
Great.
So, the next question is, what's a realistic timeline for seeing cultural change?
Oh,
We
it's
spoke
a,
about momentum and, things can take time. What's a realistic timeline?
it's $1 million question, especially around time, because again, it feels like it depends on where you are, right? What is your starting point? And then what do you measure it against? Right? Because every organization will have will measure progress differently based on what are their priorities, right? What makes more sense for them based on the needs they've identified for their business. So we often want to compare, but actually it really has to go back to where you are as an organization, what you want to achieve, and then you might see like a shift after a few months on some areas. Some others might take a few years, especially when you talk about representation. It takes time. If you want to have more diverse representation, it will take time. If it's also about creating like a culture change in terms of the language you use, how you communicate as an organization, how leaders will seek feedback and act on the feedback from employees. All those actions take time. It's not just a few 1 month, 2 months. It might take really 6 months, years to embed. And as an example with clients, and I refer back to that on the accreditation, it tends to be like a 3, 4, 5 years journey. And that's where then we have data points where we can see over this like 3, 4, 5 years, we can see then the shift. But it takes time, because then it's more about building the momentum, and then every year there is progress. And then you look back all of a sudden, and over like a long 2, 3 years, you can see how far you've gone. So I will be my answer on this $1 million question.
No, I think it's great, and I think your perspective is really informed. Seeing our accreditation clients kind of evolve, and I think getting to the point where there's no coming back, really. Like D&I is really embedded, so you can't really ignore or stop doing it. It's part of the culture and it's part of how they operate. But I think what I wanted to add is that even though it does take a few years, as Alex said, for things to get embedded and integrated, as we would say, you can see really immediate results as well. So what we see a lot in our learning programs, for example, when we teach delegates how to address non-inclusive behaviors, a phrase that we use a lot is what you permit, you promote. And we see people using that immediately after the workshop. And, when clients feedback to us, they say, people are using that language. When people see something that is not inclusive, they use that language and they address it. Of course, there's not going to change things overnight, but, the kind of 5-year disruptive change happens in those small changes as well, in kind of how people deal with things on the day-to-day. So, I think there's a lot of beauty in these journeys, isn't it? We see how things, they progressively change and move forwards. And, when you look in 5 years' time back, you're like, oh my God, we're in such a different place. And we see that a lot with clients, and it's fantastic, really. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it speaks to the importance of that cultural change. We kind of speak about DEI being kind of transformational, and it's a journey over time. So actually the timeline will shift depending on what the priorities are and the business priorities, which is, again, aligns with what we said at the beginning around aligning DEI priorities with the wider business strategy. And then you can look back and see what you've achieved over a certain amount of time, which is always great to measure that progress and see demonstrations of the impact. So yeah, I completely agree with what you both said there. Okay, I think we've got 1 minute left. So that's all we've had time for. It feels like the time has flown. So thank you so much for coming, everyone, and for sharing your questions. If we didn't have time to get to your question, as I said, a member of the team will be in touch to kind of continue the conversation. But thank you again all for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.